Good morning, and welcome to Fridays with Frank, a lecture series sponsored by the Frank Church Institute at Boise State University. My name is Garry Wenske, and I am the Executive Director of the Frank Church Institute in the School of Public Service. The Frank Church Institute was established to honor the achievements and to carry forward the principles of Senator Frank Church, who delivered the first lecture on War or Peace, the American Role at Boise State University in 1982. Given today's challenges to democracies around the world, conversations like these are even more important. On behalf of the Frank Church Institute Board of Directors, our thanks to Oppenheimer Companies, Frederick Cornforth Community Development for underwriting this series on how democracies survive and thrive in the 21st century. Today's guest speakers will address bipartisan cooperation in an age of polarization. Please welcome Peter Fenn, the founder of Fenn Communications Group. Previously, he served as Chief of Staff for Senator Frank Church, Executive Director of the Democrats for the 1980s, and co-founder for the Center for Responsive Politics. He has been a surrogate spokesman for several presidential campaigns, including President Obama. Peter serves on the boards of both the Frank Church Institute and the Robert Dole Institute. Joining him is Bill Lacy, the director of the Robert J. Dole Institute of Politics at the University of Kansas, where he has established a respected venue for bipartisan programming. Previously, he served for 20 years as a political strategist in Washington, D.C., including President Reagan's political director and major roles with 7 Republican presidential campaigns. A reminder for viewers to please send your questions in the chat box at any time during the session. Let's begin with Peter Fenn.
Thank you very much, Garry. It's really a pleasure to be here to inaugurate this series. This is a wonderful opportunity for people to engage in dialogue back and forth on politics and public affairs. Bill Lacy, it's just great to have you here. It's a real pleasure for us, and we thank you so much for, as they say, coming west from Kansas to Boise State. Bill involved me a number of years ago at the Bob Dole Institute. We did various programs together. I was a fellow during one semester, a post-election panel, other panels, and he graciously asked me to serve on the advisory board, a bipartisan board there at the Dole Institute. And Bill is a very wonderful partner to have in this. He's very thoughtful. And we might disagree, Bill, on a few things, as Republicans and Democrats sometimes do. But we're going to talk a bit today about how we can make democracy work better. And I know there's no homework assignment here for all of you who are listening, but I just want to suggest a couple things. I'm going to hold up a book, not a lovely title, but How Democracies Die, which really goes through the problems that we face not only in the United States, but around the world when it comes to democracy. And another book by Larry Diamond, who is going to be one of our speakers at our conference in November, Ill Winds. And in a little more upbeat fashion, I will provide for you our common purpose. Greg Caslow, who's a board member of the Frank Church Institute, sent this to all our board members. And this is a terrific document to sort of start leading the way to how do we make democracy work better in this country. So There's I know we have a number of students, high school and as well as BSU and others. So if you want, there's your assignment, no tests, so no tests. But so why don't we get started a little bit with one basic question that I have for Bill, and we talked about this the other day. How can you be partisan, but not, it doesn't necessarily mean you can't be bipartisan? How in your mind, Bill, does that evolve and work? And then we'll talk about some specific examples of how it does work.
Yeah, Peter and everyone at the Frank Church Institute, Gary, it's great to be part of this. I think one of the silver linings of the pandemic is that it's a lot easier for me to participate this way than getting on an airplane and flying overnight to Boise and spending the night out there and then having to come back. So it's delightful to be part of this. I'm very proud to try to help out. Peter, we were talking about this yesterday. I think Bob Dole is a great example of this. Bob Dole was bipartisan, but he was also very partisan. You could go back to his time when he was chairman of the Republican National Committee. He was considered, in fact, they used the phrase, and I don't use the phrase, but the phrase hatchet man was applied to Bob Dole because he got so partisan at times. And yet, Bob Dole was one of the leading legislators of the last half of the last century, and he was involved with a lot of Democrats on very important pieces of legislation. And I think I recounted to you the time that he got really upset with Senator Ted Kennedy, who he considered a very good friend, who said something negative about something he said on the floor, and he immediately called up Senator Kennedy and said, "Ted, I can't believe you went down on the floor and said that about me. Now I've got to go down on the floor and attack you. And I'm just giving you a heads up." And so that's, to me, how you can be partisan and bipartisan at the same time. You can represent your party's interests and your party's philosophy, but it doesn't mean that you can't find common ground on those things that you both agree on.
Bill, I think you hit the nail on the head there. And I think it's so important for people to realize that bipartisanship doesn't necessarily mean you're not being political or that you don't disagree on issues, take tough votes, but it means that you do not have to, number one, demonize the opposition. You don't have to characterize somebody's motives, and you can disagree without being totally disagreeable. I think one of the things that we're seeing today, and this is important, I think, for us to talk a little bit about, and I'm sure we'll get questions on it, is what we are seeing is, sadly, an assault on some of our basic institutions. In other words, we're seeing an assault on the free press. We're seeing an assault at times on the rule of law, and this is just in the United States, but around the world. We're seeing even a lack of reverence for constitutional democracy and a rise of extremism. And this is not, a lot of parties, a lot of people engage in this, but when you start to slip into the kinds of rhetoric that we've been seeing over the last decade or so, you've got problems. And one of the things I think that we always used to say about the Senate, Bill, when we worked there, was that you could have a knockdown, drag-out fight with the other party or with other members, and then you'd go into your little cubbies, the little offices off the Capitol floor, and these guys would have a drink with one another and talk about how they could work together on the next project, on the next issues. How can they get their staffs together? And that's very, very important, I think, nowadays to recognize that there aren't permanent enemies here, because you're going to need people. Didn't you feel that way when you worked there, Bill?
Yeah, well, I actually, Peter, never worked on the Hill per se. I always worked for Senator Dole's campaigns, and I worked in the White House two different times with President Reagan. But I remember hearing these incredible stories about Senator Dole when he was the majority leader, or when he was, the majority leader. and he would have multiple meetings going on in his office at the same time, and there'd be Republicans in there and there'd be Democrats in there, and they'd all be in different rooms, and Senator Dole would have a staff person monitoring the meeting, and he would walk into a room and ask the staff person, what's the problem here? And then he would figure out a way to bring the parties together, and then he'd go on to the next room and do the same thing in there on a completely different subject. But that's the way those guys were wired like that. And, you know, Senator Dole worked with a lot of Democrats in his time. And like I said before, passed some very significant pieces of legislation in a cooperative way by finding common ground.
I want to get to those in a second and talk about some of the things Senator Dole did and some of the things that Senator Church did during that period, not to be old guys looking at the past, but as sort of case studies of things that really may make a difference when we think about the future, which we'll also talk about. But, you know, one of the things that when we talk about the word polarization, you know, I've been doing a little bit of reading on this, and again, you and I talked about it a little bit yesterday. You know, polarization has gotten increasingly a negative term for people. In other words, what we've begun to see now is it can be dehumanizing. And I think one of the things that we have to do is sort of examine in our society, what are those things that are creating the polarization and are dehumanizing. And, you know, I started to think of the things that a lot of us were concerned about. I mean, we now have a media environment where you have a Fox News and an MSNBC, and they're considered polar opposites. They go at it. The amazing thing, and you and I have been there, but you know, you sit in a green room with somebody from the other side, and you find yourself talking about things common ground. But then, boy, once that camera light turns on, people go at each other. And of course, who gets the most airtime? Those people who are more out there, in a sense, nastier, more negative, and that's not healthy. I mean, that's what's turned me off, I have to say, to some of the talking head stuff. I think you go down the list, social media. You read and listen and concentrate on things that only you agree with. That's, you know, an incredible mistake. One of the things that I think that's happened over the course of the last 30 years, and this is something people don't talk much about it, but, you know, when you were in the Reagan White House as the political director, there were Republicans in the northern part of our country, in the Midwest, who were fairly moderate. Some of them would even be classified as liberal. There were Democrats from the South who were conservative, so that you didn't have this sort of ideological straitjacket that people were living in as they kind of are now. And, you know, how do you think, Bill, that sort of affected that inability to create some coalitions because of that ideological rigidity that's out there?
Yeah, it really is so profound, Peter. I mean, you're right. There were, you know, you remember back to the 70s and 80s, and you had liberal Republicans like Jake Javits or Lowell Weicker. I always considered Senator Church kind of more of a centrist Democrat. You had people like Scoop Jackson from Washington State, who were, you know, basically a centrist. Now everybody in the Democratic Party is in the left, and everybody in the Republican Party is on the right. And it just makes it much harder. The fact that members of Congress do not socialize together anymore, which they used to do a lot, that's a problem. The fact that they have 3- and 4-day work weeks and they go home every weekend because they have to raise money or visit with constituents or whatever, that keeps them from being together, getting to know each other personally, and it makes it, frankly, a lot easier to demonize the other side. But really, the worst thing, you nailed it, the worst thing about polarization to me is the fact that you have social media where people can basically anonymously, without really putting any skin in the game, say anything they want to say about anybody else. And then you also have that media that's aligned on a right-left continuum. And, you know, it really is not only an example of an assault on the free press, but I think the free press actually is eroding their own credibility. And I know we did a program last week at the Dole Institute, and somebody just brought out that the credibility of the news media is the lowest that it's ever been in our history, at least recorded by Gallup. And those are all real concerns.
They are real concerns, and that goes to that heart of our theme, which is, you know, how do we make democracy survive and thrive? And you have to have a vibrant free press that people appreciate, care about, pay attention to, and we're going through a tough time with it. I think one of the things I always, you know, we talk about it. I remember when I was a kid, you know, we'd have friends of our parents, and they'd say, "Oh my gosh, so and so is getting married to so and so, and gee, he's Catholic and she's Jewish. I mean, how's that going to work? This is really hard. We're going to have these marriages between people of different religious faiths." Now, of course, no one thinks at all about that. But heaven forbid you're a Democrat, you should get married to a Republican. Oh my Lord! Oh, you know,
Yeah.
How could you possibly do that? It's and I think we're a little over the top there. It seems to me, when our politics takes over in that way.
Okay.
Right. Well, you know, the thing that we have to all keep in mind is that every one of us in everyday life have to reach common ground with somebody else, whether it's for students, it's your teachers or your parents or your friends, it's our spouses, it's our bosses, it's individuals who report to us at work. We all every day have to find common ground on all kinds of topics and all kinds of issues and solving everyday problems. And yet our Congress and our leaders don't seem to be able to do that.
And you know, one of the things I think people are extremely concerned about now, Bill, and it's Senator Moynihan, who we may talk about in just a minute in his relationship with Senator Dole, but Senator Moynihan once said, you know, we're all entitled to our own opinions, but we're not entitled to our own facts. And one of the things I think that is important now is that we get back to that sort of truth, fact-based side of things, and that will help, I think, decrease that polarization a little bit. At least I certainly would hope so.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Peter. I don't know that we're going to get the genie back in the bottle. All the students get a big kick out of this because it's going to show how old that Peter and I actually are. But back when we were growing up, there were 3 television networks, and you actually believed what the anchors said. And then you would take the facts that they presented and you could argue the philosophical points beyond that. And when somebody like Walter Cronkite, after the Hue offensive in Vietnam in the late 60s, says it may be very difficult for the United States to win the war. And I don't think he said it quite like that, but that was basically the point. All of a sudden, that became the turning point in the war. I can't imagine anybody on Fox or anybody on MSNBC saying anything that would turn anybody on the other side. The other side's already turned off. So that's just the difference in the world that we live in today versus then.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, let's talk about a few of those case studies, Bill. And I think one of them that I'd like to you to lead with comment on, describe, was the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is something now that we all think of as kind of normal. It's always been around. Well, of course it hasn't. And Senator Dole was unbelievable during that period and worked with Senator Tom Harkin, late senator, well, he's not late, he's still alive, but the former senator from Iowa. And they worked really closely and carefully together over time. Describe a little bit about how that came about and why, and the obstacles that they had to overcome.
Right. Well, I need to go back and apply a little bit of context that I think will help the students, because most likely, since most of the students who are probably with us were not born or were being born at the time that Bob Dole was a Republican presidential nominee, a lot of younger people don't know a lot about Senator Dole. Senator Dole was enrolled at the University of Kansas during World War II and was running track and playing basketball and was considered a really extraordinary physical specimen. And he volunteered to go to the Army to serve in Europe. And he was and this is kind of ironic. Here is a kid from flat as a pancake, Western Kansas, who is assigned to the 10th Mountain Division. And he was a lieutenant, and he led his platoon's charge. And he was severely wounded by Nazi machine gun fire and essentially left for dead on the battlefield. But he survived, but his right arm was shattered, and he basically had no use of it. And his left arm was severely injured. And so Bob Dole became permanently disabled because of his service in the war. So that provides kind of the context for a lot of what Senator Dole did and accomplished over his entire time. And he's still with us. He's 97. He still goes down to the World War II Memorial, or he was before the pandemic, and greets honor flights. And he's just an extraordinary guy. But the ADA came about. Bob Dole, when he got elected to the Senate, his very first speech on the Senate floor was about people with disabilities. And so that was something that was a driving force for him. Senator Harkin was really the key force driving ADA, but there was a lot of opposition from business groups and other organizations at the very beginning of the process. And one of the things we used to see, Peter, that we don't really see that much anymore, is that legislating can almost be like a choreographed dance at times. It's one of those things where Bob Dole knew he could not come out right away and support the ADA, even though he strongly supported the notions, because he felt he was concerned about some of the parts of the legislation, just like the external organizations were concerned, like the Chamber of Commerce and the National Federation of Independent Business. And so they worked together. He and Senator Harkin, and there were other senators involved as well, worked very closely together to try to recraft that legislation so that they could achieve support. And ultimately they did, and achieved support, and were able to pass it. And that was 30 years ago. And it really was a landmark piece of a legislation for our country, and especially for those with disabilities.
And what struck me, Bill, about that is, and I believe Tom Harkin had a brother who also had a disability, so he understood the issue very well too. I mean, this was personal to those two, which carried a lot of weight, I think, with fellow members. But you know, one of the things that people don't quite understand is that this takes time. It takes patience. It takes adhering to the process, listening to everybody, and not rushing into it, not expecting things are going to turn on a dime. And once it came to a vote, it was fairly overwhelming. But at the initial start of this, as you point out, you read the testimony of folks from the Chamber of Commerce, traditionally Republican group, the National Federation of Independent Business, traditionally Republican group, Greyhound bus terminal. Greyhound bus people were very nervous that this was going to cost them huge amounts of money and not be workable. But throughout the process, they compromised. They found a way to bring some people along, bring people in, and it passed. And you know, I think sometimes we lack that perspective and that patience. And I will make one point here, which I think, and it's kind of a little bit of a mantra with me. You know, you see in that generation of people, Bob Dole and Frank Church, both of whom served during World War II. Frank Church was in the China, India, Burma theater as an intelligence officer. These are very young guys. And my dad, who just passed away at the age of 97, also in Italy, same area that Bob Dole served in, they came back from that war, changed people. They came back committed to doing things that moved the ball forward. They were less worried about the little stuff. And, you know, I'm not saying, and a lot of our folks who have served in Iraq and Afghanistan, in our military, other people who have done great things, volunteering, you know, or giving back to society. I think there are a lot of folks who have that sense. I love the idea of universal service. But, you know, I think one of the things that we saw amongst those people at that time was a certain comfort in their own skin, a certain ability to not get caught up in the polarization, but you really get caught up in what is it that we can do as legislators. That's my speech. Sorry, I get carried away sometimes. But I would also like, and I know you wanted to mention a couple other things. One, of course, is the tremendous work that Senator Dole did on food issues and serving the hungry, that he worked with Senator George McGovern on. And the other one, I think, was with Birch Bayh, which was really transformative on research and patents and a real creative approach to some very important issues.
That's right. Well, the Senate used to have individuals who knew each other well, and they built everything on their relationships. And, you know, today, again, when you think about it, everything works through relationships. And you got me on this program because I've had you on our programs before. And so that's the way life works. But people in Congress don't have relationships with people from the other party anymore, apparently. There are some clear examples to the contrary. But as I said to you a few days ago, I can't imagine in a crisis like America faces today that the Republicans and the Democrats couldn't agree on some amount of relief for COVID-19 and then fight over the stuff they disagreed on. But that would be the way it was done before, is you would find the things you agreed on and you would get them done. And then people like Bob Dole and Tom Harkin would sit down and figure out those disagreements. But, you know, Senator Dole was very much involved with Senator McGovern on nutritional issues, food stamps. They both received the World Food Prize simultaneously. I think you know, I know you know that we have a Dole Leadership Prize that we award generally every year. And that is a bipartisan award. And not surprisingly, Senator McGovern had received that award before he passed. We were able to welcome Senator Harkin to campus about 3 years ago to accept the award, which he got basically for his work on ADA. You mentioned Senator Bayh from Indiana. Senator Bayh and Senator Dole put together the Bayh-Dole Act, which really stimulated funding for university research. And then the other one I would bring up was in the early 80s when Social Security was about to become insolvent. And Senator Dole and Senator Moynihan from New York figured out a way to make that work. And so there's examples of that all through recent history, but we just don't see it in our contemporary history. And there are a few examples. There was an effort made, I think, to work together on immigration, and it ultimately failed. I believe that Speaker Boehner and President Obama were very close to a deal on the budget back about 10 or so years ago, as reported by Bob Woodward. That fell through because of political situations. We just can't seem to reach any accord. And, you know, you mentioned something earlier, Peter, that I think is very important about the ideological purity that we see in both parties. Now you see that when you get fatigue from one party, like in '08, '06 and '08, there was pretty serious Bush fatigue in the country. And a lot of centrist Democrats won in areas that are more centrist voting. A lot of those folks who won in '06 lost in 10 after the first 2 years of the Obama administration. And what we're seeing, and we've seen this with Clinton, we've seen it with Bush, Bush 43, we saw it with Obama, and we've seen it with Trump. The reaction to every midterm is they don't like the way the president's party is leading the country, and they get spanked in the midterm elections. And that's something we never used to see. As a matter of fact, the very first time in my life that Republicans controlled the Senate and the House was in 1994. And you don't see that kind of stability anymore. Everything is changing year to year, and the fights go on and on and on and on.
And that, that does make it just unbelievably difficult, because then you have redistricting situations, which we have not talked very much about. But, when the technology is such that you can determine street by street, almost house by house, how someone's going to vote, and you can fix the redistricting on the state legislative level as well as the congressional level, and create these districts which are solidly Democrat or solidly Republican, depending upon whether you control the state legislature and the governorship, that becomes a bit of a problem, because then you have less competitive seats and you produce fewer folks that are kind of in the middle and more people that are on, and also it creates that feeling amongst people, I just got screwed. I mean, I got 50% of the vote in Virginia, and yet I have 30% of the seats. Why is that? Well, if I come to power, I'm going to do the same to you. And that's not such a great, healthy approach to politics. And, again, people are going to be political. You can't, and we're not, as you and I know, being in this business for a long time, politics ain't beanbag. But, there's got to be a point where you say, hey, wait a minute, fairness means something here. And this is what, I was going to talk a little bit about Frank Church in this regard. I mean, I don't think there was anybody that a lot of us worked for who was the most fair, honorable, honest guy that you could ever hope to be around in Frank Church. And, even on foreign policy issues, when the Vietnam War, which you mentioned earlier, was raging, he got together with John Sherman Cooper, Republican senator from Kentucky, and they put together the Cooper-Church Amendment, which helped end the Cambodian incursion during that war. And there were times where folks would work together very, very strenuously for the good of the country. And also, I think there are times when the polarization didn't prevent people from getting started on an issue. And I'll give you an example. I was barely 30 years old. Church and I were in the car. It was the best time to get a member of Congress or senator's attention in those days without cell phones was in a car. They couldn't leave you. I mean, they had to listen to you, even if you were a 28-year-old driver. And
captive audience.
And you had a captive audience. And Church was chairman of the aging committee at the time. And this was in the 70s when inflation was taking everybody's home prices through the roof, but their savings were, senior citizens' savings, were because of inflation were less and less. And one of the things that the committee was investigating was, these poor seniors who were trying to downsize and trying to sell our houses had to pay this whopping capital gains tax on the sale of their homes. And this was basically their savings at the time. And I remember talking about it with some people after we got back. Church said, look, let's start thinking about this. And folks said, oh, you can't do anything about that. That can't happen. There's no way that. And, we started talking to more and more people. And lo and behold, you know, the capital gains exclusion, which is now, you know, people don't even think about it as anything big, but it was huge in that period in the 1970s. And you know, one of the things that you and I talked about at the Dole Institute and we're together is the job of legislators is to legislate. The job is to get things done and to move the ball forward. And it's not to score political points necessarily with a wonderful press release. You know, when you look at yourself in the mirror, and Church used to say this, you know, if I lose because I stand up for something, fine, I don't have any problem with that. But I'm not gonna, you know, I'm not gonna hide under the rug. I mean, I'm not, and Senator Dole and others had that same feeling, I think, that they are there to accomplish something. And it isn't just being a politician, although they were good politicians. It's being public servants.
Yeah, it seems today, Peter, that many members of Congress, this isn't all of them, but many members of Congress are there not to legislate, but they're there to figure out how to be reelected. I think many of them cherish an appearance on the Hannity show on Fox, the Republicans, and with Rachel Maddow on MSNBC, the Democrats. They think that's far more important to them than trying to pass some sort of important piece of legislation. And I think that that just reflects the fact that they do demonize their opponents. They don't respect their opponents anymore. There was a lot of mutual respect in the greatest generation and in senators who followed them. And they don't have personal relationships. So there's no downside to demonizing the other side. And, you know, you made the point about redistricting. The individuals who most want those solid Republican and solid Democratic districts are the members who are there now. They're not looking for fairness. They're looking to keep their seats. And that may seem harsh, but it really is true right now. There's a little bit more interest, maybe a lot more interest in hanging on to power, in keeping the tribe in the majority, so to speak, or getting the tribe in the majority than there is in solving our problems. And that's why we keep kicking the can down the road on infrastructure, on the budget deficit, on all of that.
And I want to talk about that a little bit and ask you some more questions about it. I want to mention one more thing that about Senator Church, and this is a fascinating story, I think. As far as I know, at least in modern times, there was only one committee that had co-chairs, right? The Republican co-chair and the Democratic co-chair. And that was the Special Committee on Emergency Powers that Senator Church and Senator Mac Mathias from Maryland chaired. And it was, again, an idea that folks thought, you know, wait a second, this was after, especially after the Nixon era, there are all these emergency powers that presidents have used to kind of overstep their boundaries. And so they created this, and this is before, you know, fancy computers and all kinds of things, but they created this committee. And first thing they did was to go look through the books and find out what the numbers were. And I think that that there were something like 470 emergency powers that they identified at that time. And so they created some legislation to try to bring down that number and try to be, you know, be a lot more careful about it. You know, unfortunately, because of compromise and things going back and forth, the legislation wasn't as strong probably as it should have been. And it ended up requiring a 2/3 vote to overrule the president, which is a little hefty. And so now we're seeing that issue it's rise up again because of various presidents using emergency powers, and this president, I'll get a little political here, more so than any other. And that's something, again, how democracies die, how do we make them thrive and survive in the future? looking at something like that again is probably a very important thing. But the notion that you had a Republican and a Democrat, and they were co-chairs. And maybe I'm wrong. Someone can hit the internet and say, Fenn, you're an idiot. There was another one sometime. But my recollection was that was quite an interesting, and it was a temporary. In other words, they put it in place to do a specific task, and then it wasn't created as a permanent committee. And we might think about some things like that, to get folks to focus either on issues of the budget, foreign policy issues, whatever. But I just thought I'd mention that one because I think that's something that Senator Church was quite pleased and proud of and worked very closely with across the aisle on.
Something that we used to always consistently see, Peter, is in the middle of a crisis, the country and the parties would usually unite and come together, at least for a temporary period. We saw that happen last, really, I believe, probably in the 2008 financial crisis. We saw it a little bit after 9/11 until the invasion of Iraq turned out to be likely unnecessary. But now we're in the middle of a pandemic. We're in the middle of probably the greatest interest in racial justice and equality since the 60s, at least in terms of people being, in the streets and protesting and being concerned about this problem. We're in the middle of an economic crisis, and yet you see no level of cooperation between the two parties at all. Absolutely none.
And I think those of us on our side, Democrats, think that Joe Biden could be a transformative figure in this. I mean, here's someone who understands how Congress works. Here's someone who truly, I think, is empathetic and really is looks across the aisle. He tells a story about Jesse Helms, which some people don't like, but which shows that that he really cared about someone personally. And the question is, how long is it going to take to provide that kind of sea change? And I will go back to one thing you said, Bill, and I think it is so important. The biggest mistake that was made in the 90s was to go to a 3-day work week and to put people on planes and going back and forth all the time and not being with their families and not being with other members of Congress and getting to know them personally. Because once that there was no personal connection there, that just made it so much harder for folks to work together. It does seem to me too, this is another, I'll shift a little bit here, but we may have to take some baby steps here as we move to the future. And I like to get sort of optimistic. We've hit things pretty hard so far, but there's something people agree on, when you talk to them. They agree that we need serious infrastructure help in this country. And even when he first ran for president, Trump was talking about a $2 trillion infrastructure bill. It seems to me that there ought to be ways to work across the aisle and to have bipartisan efforts on things like infrastructure. And I would also hope that we could deal with issues like climate change, even though there's a polarization on that. But most people, they argue how it's caused or what. But folks know that the fires aren't just happening out there in the West. The smoke that's pouring over, coming all the way to Kansas now, and even outside of Washington, D.C. This isn't just happening. That we have a climate crisis that we have to deal with internationally as well as nationally. So, I would, I'd ask for your thoughts and opinions and feelings about again moving that ball a little bit down the road and some of those issues.
Yeah, I think, not to be negative, Peter, but I think given personalities, it's going to be a challenge to do that. I mentioned to you the other day that I never recall a situation where the President of the United States and the Speaker of the House are openly engaged in hostile warfare and openly hate each other. I remember back to the Reagan years when President Reagan and Tip O'Neill used to have a big fight over a partisan issue, and then they'd have a beer together and kind of settle things down and try to figure out what they could do together. You know, President Reagan was probably the strongest conservative president the country's had in contemporary history. And yet he would say repeatedly, get me 80% of what I want, and that's a heck of a deal. I can't imagine people doing that now. I do think that Vice President Biden, if he is elected, he comes definitely from the old school. The question becomes then whether, if he's elected, whether he can bring back the old school or whether he is just a relic. And that's largely going to depend upon how he handles the left of your party. And if all the models today are correct, we're going to find out how that plays out. But then again, a lot of us vastly underestimated the president when he ran in 15 and 16. I remember telling a good friend who came in to see me in 1915, he said, I'm thinking about going to work for the Trump campaign. What would you advise? And I said, well, I would advise having a job plan after Iowa. And he gives me all kinds of crap about that anymore because I completely misread the Trump campaign and the power that he had to appeal to people. But you know, one of the things that was true, as best I can tell, about the president before he was elected, he was a negotiator. He worked with people. Businessmen and women have to negotiate daily, have to find common ground daily. Like we said earlier in our discussion, everybody has to find common ground, but not our political leaders. They apparently didn't get the memo.
That you know, that it is you know, it is about the people and it is about the process. Yeah, I wrote at that time and sadly got quoted in a lot of newspapers that Donald Trump, one thing, his candidacy was a joke, and that the one thing he was good at was getting press, but so was Jack the Ripper. So that oh well, you get things out there. But you know, the thing about, I think, that's pretty clear about President Trump versus Biden is that you've got someone, I think, in Joe Biden who cares a great deal about that sense of compromise. And you know, you asked the right questions, Bill. I mean, will he call in some of the leadership of his party and say, folks, no more press releases. I don't want any of these. I don't want, you know, keep the rhetoric down. We're going to move things, and we got to move them fast. Because, and as you point out, you know, one of the things that brings this country together is when there's a crisis. And, you know, whoever wins on November 3rd, COVID ain't going away. Whoever wins on November 3rd, this economic crisis ain't going away. Whoever wins on November 3rd, if you're a small business person that's out on the street, that's lost your life savings, that ain't going away. And you know, to confront the kinds of problems that this country has now and will certainly have in 2021 is going to take a different style of leadership, a different approach, and it's going to take someone who you know, again, I'm putting my political hat on here, but who thinks beyond themselves, who thinks, you know, who doesn't, you know, spend their whole day worrying about how they're covered on Fox News or MSNBC. So, you know, one of the questions I was going to ask you was, what kind of leadership do we need? But you just kind of answered that one. The next question, though, I was thinking about was, what kind of structural changes do you think might be necessary to kind of make this work? Do you have any, I'm springing this one on you. We haven't talked about it, but just out of curiosity.
Yeah, I think, Peter, some of the things that could be done would be doing something about redistricting. We've talked about that today. I don't know exactly what should be done about that, but as you mentioned, districts are not drawn in a logical way as was originally intended. They're often drawn so they don't look like any kind of a cohesive geographical area at all. And I think that's one place to start. I think if the leadership in Congress decided that they wanted to be a little bit more respectful and agreeable, I think, Mitch McConnell could sit down with Chuck Schumer. Speaker Pelosi could sit down with the Republicans. They could really try to do something to bridge the gap. And I think, a president of the United States could do that as well. I think it's clear that President Trump is not really interested in doing that. And I think if Vice President Biden wins, we'll find out if he's got the clout to be able to do that, given kind of the fact that he's considered still more of a center-left Democrat, and considering that so many of the folks who say supported Senator Sanders are pretty significantly further to the left and not all that inspired by Vice President Biden. So it would be very interesting to see how that transpires.
Mm-hmm. One of the things, speaking of some of the supporters for Sanders in particular, I'm kind of, you've done a great job at the Dole Institute, and what do you find is the most successful ways to engage young people in this, and what have you put together and done there that we might help emulate it at Boise State? We've got a number of programs you and I have talked about, but maybe you can talk a little bit about that, since after all, we're talking to a college audience here.
Right. What we do, Peter, is we really have placed an extraordinary emphasis on creating a welcoming culture for students. So we do lots of things. We have a student advisory board that usually meets 4 times a semester. They are led by a student advisory board coordinator that we select. We actually don't have elections for those posts because we believe that elections would lead to coalitions, would lead to the same kind of bickering and fighting that occurs. So we try to avoid that. We really emphasize our mission, which is to be open to bipartisanship, open-minded to other ideas, respectful of other ideas. As a libertarian conservative, I'm very much against the idea of safe spaces, but I was astounded one night when one of our program guests said, the Dole Institute is a safe space. And I was like, where is this going to go? No free speech? And it was exactly the opposite. He said it's a safe space because a student can come to the Dole Institute and say anything he or she believes and not worry about getting attacked for it. And so what we've got is we've got a little just a little group of students, and when I say little, it's in the hundreds, but a group of students who very strongly believe in bipartisanship and who believe in respecting other people's points of view, who can actually sit down and talk about topics and not get into debates over everything. I remember there's so much that we've done at the Dole Institute on the polarization and everything, and one person came through and said, Americans have a lot more in common than they think. They just will never get away from their red or blue talking points to actually get to that point. And so we're much more interested in shouting our talking points at each other from Fox or MSNBC or CNN or whatever than we are at trying to find, what we have in common. And I think we really do have more in common than people think sometimes.
I think you're absolutely right, and it's just such a joy for me to serve on both the Frank Church Institute board and and your board. You have a former Democratic governor, a former Democratic member of Congress on that board who are closely aligned with the Dole Institute, as well as former staff folks for Senator Dole. And it is those board meetings are wonderful times to share those kinds of stories. And you know, you would hope that the country was like that. I think we can start maybe with some questions. We probably, hopefully we have enough. I see Garry Wenske raising his hand there. So do we need to put ourselves on mute, or can Garry just go ahead?
Okay, Garry, comment, just comment.
So, Peter and Bill, you've each been advisors on numerous presidential campaigns. What would be your advice for the Biden and Trump campaigns?
Oh, wow. For the Biden campaign, I would say be careful not to sit on your lead. I've seen some things that seem to indicate that they're kind of a view that this election is over, which frankly I would have thought probably 60 or 90 days ago. But a little bit of closing recently has made that a little bit more iffy. So I would say don't sit on your lead. Be very well prepped for the debate, you know, don't feel reluctant to mix it up with the president. For the Trump campaign, I would say try to find a way to make your guy a little bit more empathetic about the deaths from COVID, a little bit more empathetic about some of the racial justice issues out there, and just try as best you can to do that. But what you've got, Garry, fundamentally is you've got two individuals who've been in the public eye extensively for extensive periods of time. You can't really change either one of them. All you can do is a little bit of fine tuning at the end, and whoever fine tunes the best, I think, is going to be the next president.
Yeah, I don't disagree with Bill on this. I think one of the things that that the Democrats have to realize is, of course, that even though they won the popular vote by close to 3 million votes 4 years ago, there are now even reports where, if you did some math on this, that the Democrats could even win by 5 million votes and still lose the Electoral College because of those critical states. And I think the fact that you're seeing today, you got the president of the United States in Bemidji, Minnesota. Now that's pretty unreal. And you've got the former vice president of the United States in Duluth, Minnesota. So clearly all these folks are focusing on some of these key areas and key states. And to Bill's point, I do think the Democrats are motivated, but I think that that this is in a sense back to the future for the Biden campaign. This is using all the kinds of new targeting that you have, but the personal contacts to make sure people vote, and they're, you know, they've got to do the best possible job that they can. I unfortunately for the Trump people, I think to prove or to show that Donald Trump is empathetic would be some sort of a brain transplant, to be honest with you. But maybe, you know, I used to say that sometimes that, you know, some candidates aren't terribly empathetic, but at least most of them can fake it. I mean, this guy doesn't seem to be able to fake it. But you know, I do think that he's got to probably continue to show that he's a strong leader, that he's going to move the country forward, and get people to believe in some of that. The enthusiasm of his voters does not seem to be a problem, but he does have to break into the suburbs, because if he's going to lose the suburbs, handily, which some of the polls show, then he seriously has problems in a lot of those swing states, like Pennsylvania, like Michigan, like Wisconsin, Minnesota, even places like Georgia. The other problem I would say with where things are going in a key voting group, you saw seniors moving off of Trump earlier. And I think this accounted maybe for some of Bill's sense that things were moving the wrong way for Trump. It's still true, but I think the COVID stuff sort of settled in a little bit. But I think the importance of the senior vote for both candidates is out there, and also bringing in the case of Obama, the Hispanic and African American votes. I think there's a lot of uncertainty here, and that first debate on the 29th will be absolutely key. I think, Gary, we could talk for another half hour about this, but there are probably a few other questions you got too.
All right, we have another question here. After the 2020 census, what are the chances of enlarging the House of Representatives substantially to make it in the Electoral College more representative?
Oh, that's a tough one. I'm not sure, Peter, what you'd have to do to, quote, enlarge Congress.
You know, that strikes me as a real tough nut to crack. First of all, I'm not quite sure it's a smart thing to do, because right now you got 535 people running around there. How many more House representatives do you want? I get the question though, because obviously now you're representing more and more people as a member of the House. I think the more interesting thing would be, is there any move on the Electoral College to change how that works? Given, see what the results of the race here. I think that's a tough one. I'm not sure that's going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah, I think big structural change like that is not likely in the near future.
Another question for Peter particularly, but Bill, you can respond. You've been involved with the National Endowment for Democracy to encourage democracies around the world. Should there be a similar organization focused on U.S. civic and democratic infrastructure?
I think that's a really great question, and something that we've all talked about, especially at the Frank Church Institute. I often said that a lot of the work that many of us did in Eastern Europe, Gary, you included, South Africa, Mozambique, even in the early days, Russia, and were amazingly eye-opening and fruitful for many of us. And we find ourselves, I think, now in a situation where we need to clean up our own house, where we need to do a lot more with civic education, with educating young people. And this should start at younger ages. It shouldn't just be college or university level, although we need to do as much as we can there too. But there's some indication that there's been a jump. I think the Pew poll just came out, which indicated more people were a little bit more sophisticated about the three branches of government and what Congress does and doesn't do than they have been lately. But this is a big deal. And this goes to that question that Bill and I talked about a little bit more, which is a little bit earlier, which is, facts matter, process matters. How people learn and understand what they've got in the United States and other democracies matter. So, I think we need to do a lot of work on that. And that's where I'm just so appreciative of places like the Dole Institute and like the Church Institute and other institutes around the country that are striving to put that front and center.
Yeah, I don't know what the case is, with the Church Institute, but we find at the Dole Institute that a lot of history and civics is no longer being taught. And I think most of us would agree that understanding history helps you plan for the future because you know what's worked and what hasn't worked in the past. And I think that many young people are not being exposed to civics anymore or to history, and they're not hearing about the importance of voting and being civically engaged. And frankly, many had rather, and this is true for adults too, it's not just students, but many folks had rather tune in to the NFL on Sunday afternoon than tune in to a presidential debate that's talking about the future of the country. And that's a sad commentary. And I think that we desperately need more attention paid in high school and even prior to high school in terms of fundamental civics and civic engagement and how students can develop tools that they need to make a difference. That's what we really focus on, Peter, as you know, at the Dole Institute, is focusing on giving students tools so they can make a difference with them. And we really see that as kind of our fundamental, it's a fundamental part of our mission.
Yep.
Another question. Idaho has a bipartisan commission for reapportionment for drawing district boundaries, and Idaho allows same-day registration to vote. What other measures could encourage voting and equity and representation?
Well, I think, having geographically equitable congressional districts would be good. Ending as much as possible or reducing gerrymandering so there would be more competitive seats would be a net plus, I think. I think that those are the kinds of things we got to look at. But ultimately, I believe that we have to change attitudes and we have to build relationships, and that's something that is simply is not working in Congress today or in politics at all. We're so tribal that everything is driven by our tribalism rather than thinking like Americans. We think largely like Democrats or Republicans, and we all have to change in that respect. I don't think it's just a matter of structurally changing things. I think that it's going to be hard to get structural reform without some degree of agreement between the parties.
I think that's right. And, there's been talk for a long time about making Election Day a national holiday so that people can go vote. My only concern is I hope people don't decide they're going to go on vacation and not vote. But certainly, the whole notion of making voting easier makes perfect sense. I don't think it shouldn't be a partisan issue, to be perfectly honest, and it has become one. That's where we've gotten tribal. But I think to the central point, which is if you hear as a voter or a potential voter that the fix is in, that it's rigged, that it's all meaningless, that no one cares about you, that you're just a cog in the wheel, those kind I think, not to get nostalgic about this, but after World War II, people came back. Voting was kind of a big deal. When we were little kids, we'd bring brought into the voting booth with our parents. This was an important part about being an American. And so, it's bringing that rhetoric down on things being rigged, which hopefully would help. And I think more projects, more voter education projects, more parts of just encouraging people that their vote matters. I mean, if you start looking these bipartisan commissions, a lot of them have worked out pretty well. Iowa is a great example. If you look at the Iowa map, say, versus the North Carolina map, you see contiguous districts. You see fair congressional districts, whereas you see salamanders going through North Carolina, or you have until recently, and that should be a universal approach. There's no question in my mind about it, and that takes some education of people and voters. And I think the press has to step up. Our educational institutions have to step up. Our members of legislatures, Congress, local, and in fact, most of this, gets really brought home at local levels, where folks are winning or losing elections by, a handful of votes, or in the case of 2000 Florida, by a handful of votes. So it's not that your vote doesn't count; it does count. So I think we need to drum that in harder.
Yeah, I think it's really ironic, guys, if we think back to right after the 2016 election, so many people were taking to the streets to protest the outcome of the election, and somebody polled those individuals, and a huge percentage of them hadn't voted. And so, I mean, it's ironic to me, because here they could have taken a few minutes to vote, potentially change the outcome of it, but yet they didn't do that. But then when they don't like the outcome, they go and they spend all night protesting it. And they have that right. I'm not objecting in any way to that, but I'm saying spend the time on the front end. If you don't like the way things are going, vote.
And when you think about 75,000 votes in 3 states determining the outcome of the 2016 election, and you're a Democrat, and you say, good grief, it's almost 3 million votes we won by, and we couldn't handle 75,000 votes in 3 states. I mean, in a sense, that's kind of our problem. I mean, and if Democrats, as Bill said earlier, if Democrats don't get that in 2020, they got a problem. I think they get it, but anyway, that's just me. Sorry, Gary.
Another question. Should social media platforms be regulated, or how should they be encouraged to support the public interest?
Oh, gosh. That's a fascinating question, because I think Peter and I would agree that social media is currently a big part of the problem, because of the complete tribal mentality you see expressed in social media, and because of the anonymity. Someone can go on and attack somebody without their name even appearing. It's really, in my view, kind of a cowardly way to do things, but it's the way things are done now. When you start talking about regulating and stuff like that, you start getting into freedom of speech and those issues, and it's difficult to do that. And I'm sounding like a broken record, Gary, but I really do believe that regulating, passing laws, structural reform, all those kinds of things are important. But what is also important is for the American people to really demand accountability in their office holders. And I don't see that coming in the near future. So I think all of these other things are going to be especially difficult to do in that kind of an environment.
I'm a little bit more aggressive on this than Bill is. I think we've got, not only a problem now, but a potentially much more serious problem down the road with social media, because it's so ubiquitous now. At the beginning, people thought, well, Facebook or Twitter, or, how many people have access to this, and how the speed of the internet and computers, but now it is so out there, and the ability, as we know, of nefarious actors, particularly foreign actors. The Russian stuff is very clear from 16. It's clear now. The Chinese are getting in the game. who knows who else is getting into this, and the inability, again, as Bill says, to know who the heck these people really are. And look, what drives Facebook? What drives Twitter? Advertising dollars. We need to study this very carefully and find out what ways we can determine, who is writing the checks, who is putting this stuff together. And most of it, as we found from 2016, is calculated. So, I mean, whether you call it hate speech or not, I don't know, but it's really negative stuff, and the kinds of metrics that are put behind it are potentially extraordinarily damaging. And so I think this is something that we've, it at least deserves a very strong commission, group of people who are real experts in this field, and is not just driven by the heads of these companies, because they don't have a real incentive to change things very much, it appears.
Couple of questions here. First one, who identifies himself as a millennial. He says, to me, all national politics looks really bad. And what would be a really historic step to normalization? And that ties into the theme of these lectures. How would you encourage students to become more involved in the themes? How democracies survive and thrive in the 21st century?
I mean, what I would say, Gary, is that millennials are our leaders of the future. They're going to be making decisions sooner than they may think, and they're going to be in positions of authority perhaps sooner than they think. That's the one thing that I'm curious as to Peter's take on this. But one thing about politics that I found to be true when I got into it as a former college student, and I believe is still true today, is that there is tremendous upward mobility in politics. You can have a very strong effect in politics. You can make a difference. And I think understanding and encouraging young people to believe that they can make a difference is what we have to do to achieve that. I think that Peter just gave a great example, which I hadn't heard until a few minutes ago. 75,000 votes switched in 2016 would have changed the outcome of the election. That to me says precisely that a few people can make a lot of difference. I know when I was a college student on a campus in Nashville, Tennessee, that a group of us who were conservative banded together because we didn't like the fact that all the speakers that they were bringing in were liberals. So we wound up then getting speakers like, after we protested and created a lot of attention and demonstrations and everything, we were able to get speakers like future President Ronald Reagan and conservative columnist and author William F. Buckley Jr. I think the idea is you can make a difference. So give it a shot, give it a try. But there needs to be more places like the Church Institute and the Dole Institute that show students how they can do that and give them the tools to do that.
I think that's such an important point, Bill, and I don't think a lot of young people understand that, and the personal stories of people who got involved in politics, went to work for a member of Congress, actually helped pass legislation. I often tell folks that story about the capital gains tax on the sale of homes for people. Not that I was an instrumental person in it, good grief, but that the feeling of accomplishment that you can have, and you can climb the ladder pretty fast in politics if you really work hard, if you come up with good ideas if you really engaged in it. And it isn't about, you know, pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. It isn't about making a lot of money. It's, you know, it's about doing things that really give you a sense of satisfaction. And some of the stories that people can tell young people, I think hopefully will inspire them, and with leaders that they worked hard with, worked hard for. And the other thing that I would say, and it's very interesting. I often have done debates with Pat Buchanan and Bay Buchanan in front of college audiences, some very conservative. And one of the things that I always seem to get a good response to is the whole notion, as I just alluded to quite a bit earlier, the whole concept of universal service. I just think that in this country, that if we establish a system of universal service, a year, 2 years, you do it, you get get money to pay for your higher education or graduate school. You know, it's between 18 and 25, you know, whether it's in the military or doing something for your country, giving something back. This is something that we've talked about for a long time, that I just think would pay huge dividends in terms of civic engagement and civic education. And the second thing that I believe strongly in, again, these may be pie in the sky things a little, but I think we should have, you know, year-round school. I mean, I think that the notion of having that big time in the summer where people get away from classrooms, just change the calendar so that folks get different times of vacations but they're constantly in it. We don't really need it anymore. It used to be that you needed that summer because you're working on the farm and the kids had to go out and especially teenagers and help work the farm. You know, that's not necessary really in most places any longer. But the main thing is universal service. I just think that would pay just tremendous dividends, wouldn't cost a lot of money.
Very good. Well, our time is growing short, so I want to thank both Peter and Bill for their time. And if you have any final thoughts, happy to hear them.
Well, I just want to thank Garry, you and Peter for the opportunity to be part of a Church Institute program. It's been a fascinating discussion, and just say to young people out there, you can make a difference. Get involved, get engaged. We do a lot of our programs interview style at the Dole Institute, and I interview our guests, and I always have a research assistant. My research assistant from 4 years ago is now running a U.S. Senate race in the state of Kansas. That's how quickly that you can move up in politics. So get involved, commit to your passion, go out and work for it.
You know, I just want to thank Bill too for taking the time and doing this, and for all the tremendous work that he does at the Dole Institute. And Garry, you too, and our board of directors at the Frank Church Institute. It's just a tremendous group of folks. And I'll make one final comment, and that is, you know something? It's fun. You know, it really is fun to be involved in politics, to be engaged, you know, to work with the kind of people that we've all had the pleasure of our whole life. You know, starting with Frank Church on with many candidates, I've loved every minute of it. And so I agree with Bill. Get engaged, get involved, and I think you're going to make a plea, I hope, Garry, for people to vote this November, regardless of what party, but get out there and vote. That's important.
Absolutely. And before I do, let me remind viewers that the next Fridays with Frank will be held at 10 a.m. October 2nd with the former FBI official Chuck Rosenberg. But for all student viewers, please join in the Boise State All Campus Challenge by going to idahovotes.gov the stakes are too high for you not to vote. Thank you and goodbye.